Welcome to my YouTube channel, where we discuss all things related to economics, business, and investing. This episode is going to cover the topic of minimum wage. Minimum wage has come into the spotlight recently as newly elected U.S. President Joe Biden had initially stated his intentions to include a minimum wage hike in his $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. This provision would raise federal minimum wage from its current $7.25 per hour, nearly doubling it, to $15 per hour. Now, at the time of making this video, this provision has not yet made it out of the Senate. It's looking like right now it's not going to pass. However, it's at least possible that this provision could be reintroduced again at some later point in the future, even in President Biden's first term. So as it turns out, raising minimum wage to $15 per hour could have many negative side effects, though not perhaps intended by those advocating for it. But in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a holistic look at minimum wage. So we're going to go back about 100 years. We're going to examine why minimum wage came about, what were the reasons for why it was introduced, and then we're going to fast forward 100 years later to right now, and we're going to see where minimum wage stands right now. We're going to look at a few vignettes. So we're going to look at an example, a use case of a typical American small business and how it would be affected by the minimum wage hike. We're also going to do a brief deep dive into some salary and employment data, and we're going to see what would happen to minimum wage earners if their salaries were suddenly doubled. And so in the last part of the video, I'm going to give you a few suggestions for what you can do to get ready and to protect yourself should this legislation ever pass. So the concept of minimum wage started in Western countries in the late 19th and early 20th century. At that time, there were a group of elite business owners known as the robber barons. You might be familiar with names such as Andrew Carnegie, who dominated the American steel industry, John D. Rockefeller, who through his Standard Oil Corporation would end up controlling 90% of U.S. oil refineries, or J.P. Morgan, a banking magnate whose bank, J.P. Morgan, would go on to largely control the U.S. financial system. These business moguls literally dominated their various industries in their respective heydays. It turns out these industries often had sweatshop working conditions, and wages were fairly low. As just mentioned, Rockefeller's Standard Oil at one point controlled 90% of all oil refineries in the U.S. It would have been possible, in many cases, to keep wages artificially low, given the monopoly conditions. One of the original purposes of minimum wage was to simply allow workers to earn what was the fair free market price for the services they were providing to these monopoly industries. In other words, so the economics here is that the monopoly environment was keeping wages artificially low, and then minimum wage comes along and artificially raises wages, but with the net result that wages were more or less fair and where they should have been, right? So while this may have been true in the very beginning, what we're going to see later in this video is that the suggestion to increase modern minimum wage to $15 an hour is really a large deviation and distortion from the original purposes of the policy. So what we're going to look at now is an example of a small business in the U.S. which relies heavily on minimum wage workers, and there are lots of such businesses that are in that scenario. I should note here that, of course, any small business in the U.S. which does not have any workers who are earning minimum wage or less than $15 an hour would not be affected. And so one point to make here is if you're watching this video and you're a lawyer or an engineer or something and you're making it a $50 an hour, then of course this legislation is not going to have any effect on you, although it's still good to understand what I'm talking about here. So let's say there's a small business called ABC Supplies and Things. It has an owner, 2 employees working in sales and marketing, and also 2 employees working in logistics. Let's take a look at their balance sheet. Here's a breakdown of the cost of ABC's 4 employees per year. At a rate of $7.25 per hour, the current minimum wage, an 8-hour day, 5 days per week, and 52 weeks per year, their salaries cost about $60,000. Now, assuming top-line sales of $160,000 minus the $60,000 in employee salaries, this would leave a net income of about $100,000. One important point to make here is that 86% of small businesses in the U.S. have incomes of less than $100,000 per year. So this is actually an example of a relatively successful small business. Many small businesses would be in worse shape. So now we're going to look at the balance sheet for the same company, but after minimum wage has been raised to $15 per hour. So the math here is pretty similar. 4 employees working 8 hours per day for the entire year now earn $125,000. Top line sales remain the same at $160,000, but with a large increase of salaries, this leaves only a paltry $35,000 in net income. The business owner now makes roughly the same amount as the employees, yet assumes all the risk and work of doing a business. So what is a small business to do? So there's a number of ways a small business would attempt to cope with the minimum wage hike. First, they can try to raise their sales by passing higher prices to customers. There's issues with that because that can actually cause sales to go down. The owner can also accept a lower profit margin, but as we just saw, this isn't a very good situation for the owner to be in, and an owner in this situation might just decide to quit and actually take a job somewhere else. Finally, a small business can lower its expenses by laying off employees, and in practice, a small business would probably do all three of these things to try to survive. I wish to reiterate here that the scenario we just looked at for small businesses in the U.S. would probably be fairly close to a best-case scenario. Many small businesses in the U.S. would have a much harder time coping with the doubling of the minimum wage. What we're going to look at next is a before and after comparison of minimum wage earners to the 5 quintiles of all wage earners in the U.S. And what we're going to see is that the minimum wage increase places these workers in a very uncompetitive position as compared to many other wage earners in the U.S. So before we dive into this graph, I wanted to take a few moments and explain what this graph is actually showing. Each of the 5 orange bars on the right represents a quintile, or 1/5 of the U.S. population. On the bottom, it shows the average incomes of each quintile in 1970, and on the top, it shows the average incomes in 2019. So we would read the top quintile on the right by saying that in 1970, top 1/5 earners in the U.S. earned about $22,000 per year, while in 2019, this same group earned a bit more than $250,000. On the far left, the green bar represents minimum wage workers. The axis on the left shows the change in income as a percentage over the original value in 1970. This graph says that minimum wage earners increased their annual pay from about $3,300 in 1970 to $15,000 in 2019, for an increase of about 450%. In contrast, the highest quintile of wage earners increased their pay from $22,000 in 1970 to about $250,000 in 2019, for a whopping 1,200% increase. Even the bottom 3 quintiles increased their pay by about 700% over this period. So it's clear from this chart that minimum wage earners, in terms of percentage growth, did not keep pace with the rest of the workers in the U.S. Now keep in mind that this graph assumes the current $7 minimum wage level. Now in the next chart, we're going to look at the same data, except we're going to assume now that minimum wage earners are making $15 per hour for an annual income of $31,200. What we see here is that the proposed $15 minimum wage hike leaves minimum wage earners in a situation where their income has grown since 1970 more than all but the very highest quintile in the U.S. This is an economic distortion because most minimum wage jobs might not have been able to command such an increase in a free market environment. As a result, this runs the risk of leaving many minimum wage earners too expensive for the tasks they are doing. This graph is one way to demonstrate that a high minimum wage hike would leave these workers in a precarious position with regard to what they earn versus what their jobs deliver. We could try to come up with a new minimum wage value whose increase might be pegged to the lowest quintile. If we did that, we would come up with an hourly rate in the $11 to $12 per hour range. However, the best thing for government to do here would be to just avoid all interference and instead allow the free market to determine everyone's wages. If the government does want to be proactive, then they should do things like lower corporate taxes for businesses, employing lower wage earners, or perhaps offer tax incentives for hiring such workers. In the final part of this video, I'm going to suggest a few steps you can take to protect yourself if you are a worker who might be impacted by the proposed minimum wage hike. As mentioned, this law, if enacted, could potentially affect any worker earning less than $15 per hour. And here's a fun fact you might not have known. Roughly 25% of all workers in the U.S. currently make less than $15 an hour. So this law, if passed, could have an impact on 25% of pretty much everybody working in the U.S. Now, while this legislation might be off the table for now, it could easily be reintroduced in the future. So therefore, it's a good exercise for us to sit here together and try to brainstorm some options you might have to weatherproof your job against this policy. So here's 3 things you can do to protect your job if you make under $15 an hour. So the first bit of advice I would say is, and I would say this to anybody at any job is you should take your job seriously. So this means showing up on time, doing high quality work, and basically doing anything you can do to stand out as someone who's worth being retained. The second thing you can try doing is upskilling yourself. And when I use the word upskill, I mean giving yourself a new skill set which increases your worth to your employer. So as an example, let's say you have a back office job and you're maintaining Excel spreadsheets. So something you could learn to do would be to learn to write macros, branch out into other areas of programming or engineering, and make yourself just worth more than what you currently are. And the last example I'm going to give, or the last suggestion rather, which is certainly not my favorite, but I'm going to mention it, is if you are, let's say you are working for a small business, similar to the one in the example I gave earlier in the video. One option you can do is to change jobs and switch up to a larger employer. So to give you a quote, McDonald's CEO Chris Kempinski recently stated that he foresees no problem whatsoever with Biden's potentially $15 an hour minimum wage hike. And one reason for that is that large companies can deal with a bureaucracy and increases in wages a lot better than a small business. A small business that relies heavily on minimum wage workers is pretty much stuck. A larger employer can find ways to shuffle things around to make it work. So that's one option, but not my favorite. So obviously the decision to change jobs is a very big one. It should not be taken lightly. You should really only do it if it's the best decision for you. But what I'd say is if you're in this situation and you get a job offer from a larger employer and you think you'd be happy there, go big, because right now the big boys are going to be the ones that are going to weather the economic crisis in the U.S. and from most places elsewhere in the world. Okay, so that's the end of my video. I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to watch. And if you found that the information in this video was insightful or useful to you, please click the subscribe button at the bottom of your screen. When you click the subscribe button, it'll help me deliver more content to you in the future. Thanks again.